On a hot summer day in the early 1900s, a man named Ole Evinrude set out to get ice cream for the girl he was dating. The only problem was that the shop was on the far side of the lake, and he had to row. And row he did, but on the way back, under a baking sun, the ice cream began to melt. What if, Ole wondered, what if I had a motor on this damn boat? By the time he reached the opposite shore, the ice cream was nothing but cream. But he had an idea that would transform boating forever. This is the story of Ole Evinrude, the man who invented the first successful outboard motor. There is only one way to start this episode, in my opinion. It has to start like this. This is, of course, the sound of an outboard motor. And for me, it's also the sound of summer. As a kid, I usually spent my summers on the west coast of Norway with my uncle and aunt. We'd often go fishing, and the outboard motor was always our best friend. This was back in the 90s, and I want to say that my uncle had an Evinrude motor on his boat, but I can't remember. What I do recall is that my uncle sometimes struggled to get it started. He'd pull the cord once, then again, sometimes even 3 or 4 times before the engine finally responded. It wasn't about his skills, I don't think. He was an experienced boatman. But sometimes things require more than one try. And that is really the theme of this episode. Ole Evinrude's story is a story of resilience, of failing and trying again, and again, and again. And it's a story that begins in Norway. Here is Bob Jacobson, who has written a book on Evinrude.
Ole Evinrude was born on April 19th, 1877, and he was one of 11 children, of which he was the oldest male. And his parents were Andrew and Beata Evinrude. His mother's maiden name was Dahl. And he grew up on a farm that was about 60 miles, which I guess is about 100 kilometers outside of Christiania, which, as we know, a couple decades later became Oslo.
Why did they move to the US? Were they poor? What triggered the move?
Like so many immigrants from all over Europe, they were looking for more opportunity. Ole's father, Andrew, was a farmer, but most of the rest of the family were seafaring people. And Three of Ole's uncles had been lost at sea, and his father wanted no part of that. He wanted a different life. He was committed to farming, and obviously at that time there was lots of wide open expanse in various parts of the New World, and so the family came over and settled in Wisconsin, where Andrew started farming here.
Evinrude's interest in engines and mechanics started early. Some say it showed itself already on the voyage to America.
He was 5 years old when the family came over, and according to the story, during the entire trip, Ole kept sneaking off into the engine room because even at the tender age of 5, he was fascinated with engines and how they worked, and you could say that perhaps that presaged what he would end up devoting his life to.
The family settled in Cambridge, Wisconsin. Ole Evinrude's schooling was meager, though he had a good head on his shoulders.
At that time, public education was not mandatory, and he was really smart, and he was already far beyond what he was going to learn in school in certain topics like math. And in farming families, once you got to be about 10 years old, you started helping on the farm. That was just how it worked back then.
Hmm. And Ole did help out in on the farm, but he didn't necessarily do the dirty work. He also got some bigger tasks, let's say. Can you tell a little bit about that?
Well, his engineering aptitude was apparent really early on, and he was really good with tools, and and so often his responsibility would be to make sure the tools were in working order. He could fix things that most children his age would not have had any idea how to do. And also, he would work during the winters and I'm not sure exactly what age this started. It probably was not quite that young, but at a pretty early age, he would work during the winter when you couldn't work on the farm in a tobacco warehouse. And even as a teenager, he would use all the money he made doing that to buy engineering magazines so he could increase his knowledge in that area because he was just totally fixated on it. He really didn't care much for the whole farming thing, and he had no intention of following in his father's footsteps, much to Andrew's chagrin.
And talking about fixations, my understanding is that he also had a fixation on boats. And
Yes.
can you tell me about, and he started building his own boats, didn't he? But it wasn't like his dad liked it too much.
No, that's exactly right. So Ole built his first boat at age 15. His father did not want him to do that. He was prohibited from doing this. His father basically took the position, no son of mine is going to be a boat builder. He's going to be a farmer like me. And part of it was because of the family history of the relatives having died at sea. So it's almost like a biblical story where Ole built a boat and his father proceeded to smash it to smithereens. But and this is one of the first stories that really illustrates Ole's persistence, even from that early age. And this is kind of a theme that carries out through the rest of his life. He would not be deterred by a mere smashing of his first boat. He proceeded to build another boat, but this time he went about it more cleverly. He would build pieces of it and hide them in different places around their property. So even if his father found one of them, he couldn't instantly identify it as a piece of a boat. It could have been anything. And so that's how he ended up buying his next boat or building his next boat. And, at that point, Andrew was kind of figuring out, okay, I don't think there's anything I can do to stop this kid. So he managed to complete a really nice boat. And when he was still a teenager, he started charging people 25 cents a ride to take a ride on his boat on nearby Lake Ripley, which is right next to Cambridge. And in fact, if you go to Lake Ripley today, there's a sign honoring Ole Evinrude and his connection to Cambridge. And there's actually lots of good Ole Evinrude memorabilia in the Cambridge Historical Society.
The income also advanced his career, since he could now afford more magazines to continue his self-taught education. He also saved enough money to accept a low-paying apprenticeship at a machine shop.
He was essentially piecing together an education as an autodidact that most people would get from going to a university and getting an engineering degree. So first he does his apprenticeship in a machine shop and he learns about the different tools and machines and their roles. And then he was off to Pittsburgh, which, as a lot of people know, was the kind of epicenter of the steel industry. And that's where he learned about steel making and metallurgy. And then after a short time there, he came back to the Midwest and was living in Chicago, where he learned design and pattern making, which is cutting and shaping metal into forms that can be usable to manufacture something. And that was enough to really start his career as a professional because by the time he was 23 years old, and this would have been right at the turn of the century, in the year 1900, he moved back to Milwaukee and got a job as the uh, head pattern maker at EP Alice Company, which became a very important company during the Industrial Revolution. They were making steam engines at that time, and they continued to be an important engine maker for ages to come.
While working at EP Alice, he thought of a new combustion engine. But where did this idea come from?
Well, he certainly wasn't the first one to think of it. This was, during a time where, inventors all over the place were coming up with internal combustion engines, and as we all know, that changed civilization permanently. We're still feeling the effects, and so he got on board very early because he was keeping very current on the industry because he read voraciously and followed what was going on at other companies. So he knew that this was going to be the next big thing. And there's a wonderful another one of these stories that helps illustrate Ole's persistence and ingenuity, where he was living in the basement of a boarding house, or he was living in this boarding house, and he was using the basement kind of as his personal workshop. And so he builds this gasoline engine, but there weren't gas stations or places you could just go and buy a bunch of gas to power your engine. But the lights were gas powered back then because the whole city wasn't wired with electricity yet. So he takes the gas pipe that powered the lights and feeds that into his gas engine. And of course, it worked great, but his landlady was having a dinner party at the time and all the lights went out because he was using all the gas to power his engine.
Right.
So she wasn't too happy with that, but
At the time, there was a race to create the first well functioning car. Evinrude took part in this effort and launched a car named Eclipse.
the Eclipse was a perfectly functional car. It was loud. It didn't work great, but most of the cars being designed at that time were really loud and didn't work great. But really, the failure of the Eclipse and that company had more to do with just lack of luck, lack of business acumen. Had things played out differently, he could have been Henry Ford. Ole Evinrude could have been the guy who put automobiles on the map, but it didn't turn out that way. That company fizzled, and other companies emerged that were more successful in the business realm and just had more luck in getting their products to capture the fancy of the public who was clamoring for a new way to get around.
Mm. But you're still, you not still, you live in Wisconsin. Was that like, I'm like, it was obviously the Midwest, but was that really like the hotbed of new innovations, or was that more towards Chicago? I mean, like, was it an advantage or a disadvantage that he was living in Wisconsin, you think?
It was actually pretty much an advantage. Wisconsin was one of the hotbeds. I mean, you had the Alice Company making steam engines. You had plenty of this industry going on in Milwaukee. Now, I personally am originally from Detroit, where and Detroit, just because of where the successful innovators happen to be based, became the epicenter of the automobile industry. But it could have been Milwaukee had things played out a little differently. That industrial hub that comprises Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, various other nearby cities, and really, frankly, going all the way to Pittsburgh and Eastern Ohio, where the steel was being produced. It was all happening in that cluster of the country. So being in Milwaukee was not at all a disadvantage.
Hmm. The Rust Belt wasn't rusty yet.
No,
Oh.
it was still shiny.
Shiny was also Evinrude's love life at the time. By the turn of the century, he had met Bess.
Well, they initially met because Bess lived next door to the shed that Ole had rented to work on his early internal combustion engines, and that's how they got to know each other. And then when he got into the gasoline engine business with Clemick, They hired Bess as their bookkeeper, so that's how they got to know each other. And then, over time, that relationship bloomed into romance. And I know where you're going with this, leading up to the the ice cream story.
Yeah, go for it. What is the ice cream story?
All right. So this is the most famous story about how Ole Evinrude got the idea for the outboard motor. Um, it's 1906. Uh, he was still he had opened his own pattern making shop by then. He gave up on the car business that hadn't worked out, but he was doing okay. He was had his little industrial design shop going, and it was okay. And Bess was working for him, and he was courting her at this time, and one day they decided to go with another couple on a picnic, and what they did was they took a rowboat and rowed across Okachi Lake, which is in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin, which is outside of Milwaukee, and so they row across the lake, and they're having their nice little picnic. And at some point, Bess says it was a hot summer day, and Bess says, "Boy, I sure could go for some ice cream right now." So Ole, wanting to uh, win Bess's favor, hops back in the rowboat, rows all the way back across the lake, buys the ice cream, gets back in the boat, rows all the way back across to where they were picnicking. And of course, it being a hot 95-degree summer day, the ice cream is completely melted by the time he gets back. And at that point, the light bulb over his head goes off. He says, "Wow, what if there was a way to attach a motor to the rowboat so you could get across a lot faster and get the ice cream back across before it all melted? Wouldn't that be something?" And thus the idea for the outboard motor was spawned. Now, I should also mention that he wasn't the only person, or even the first person, to get the idea of attaching a motor to a little boat. Um,
Yeah.
Around the same time, and there was a guy in Detroit named Cameron Waterman who actually beat him to the punch. And Waterman, by 1907, was already making and selling an outboard motor called the Porto in Detroit, which, it's not surprising he was in Detroit because there was tons of internal combustion engine stuff going on in Detroit by that time, with the nascent auto companies having sprung up around there. And yeah, so by 1907, Waterman was selling, or had already sold 3,000 of his Porto motors that year. And that company stayed in business for another 10 years until 1917.
Hmm. But as you said, he wasn't the first one to build the outboard motor, but he was the first one to build a successful one. What
Yeah,
made his one successful?
well, his was just better. It worked better. Just like, some of the cars being invented worked better than others. Some were just these loud, smoky disasters. They drove, but it was the ones that actually could be somewhat pleasant to drive that eventually won out. And similar with the outboard motor, he designed his first outboard motor in 1907, and they lugged it to the Kinnickinnick River in Milwaukee, along with Bess's brother, Russ Carey, and they tested it out, and it worked really well. It was really loud. It wasn't ready for the market yet. It was so loud that Bess affectionately called it the coffee grinder. Um, but again, it was a learning process, and at that point, Ole figured out he needed to add a muffler, so he added a muffler to it, and it got a lot quieter. And by 2 years later, he cleaned up the design, reduced the noise quite a bit, and they were ready to start selling them in 1909.
With Bess taking a prominent role in the business, the days of poor marketing were over. They began inviting potential customers to demonstrations.
In 1909, they invited a whole mess of people to a demonstration on another nearby lake, really close to there, called Pewaukee Lake, which is in Waukesha County outside of Milwaukee. And they the motor at that point weighed 62 pounds, and so they arbitrarily decided to charge $62 for the motors on the dollar a pound basis, as if they were in a grocery store. And they immediately got 10 orders because by that time it worked really well. And
Yeah.
people are like, yeah, I want to have one of those things so I can go get ice cream for my girlfriend.
Yeah, and talking about this girlfriend, or probably wife by now,
Yep, they
she,
got married in 1907.
yeah, and she ends up playing a pretty like pivotal role in the business as well, especially as far as marketing goes, isn't that?
Yeah, absolutely. She was the marketing genius in those early days. She came up with all their cute slogans, and when they started advertising, she was the one that was designing the ads that helped the company grow very, very quickly. Um, there was their early motto was "Don't row," which I think is just brilliant in its conciseness and elegance. I wish I had that kind of marketing genius. My career would have been very different. But they took out the "Don't Row" ads in Milwaukee newspapers, and the very next year, 1910, they got 1,000 orders. So naturally, they had to ramp up production very quickly, and they moved to a bigger shop, and before long, he was employing 100 people to make these things.
But not everything she came up with did catch on. She also tried to introduce a term or a verb called to Evinrude. What was that all about?
Yeah, that's one of those cases, and yeah, I think a lot of us have tried to do that. Turn a name or a word that is a noun into a verb, into the action of doing or using the thing. So they tried to get going motorboating to be called Evinruding. Let's go Evinruding, and it never did catch on in the same way that um, it didn't become one of those brand names that seeped into regular language like Frisbee or Kleenex or those other brands. It was too weird of a name. Like maybe if he had had a simpler, less ethnic sounding name, it would have caught on.
Yeah. The ethnic sounding name may, however, have been an advantage when he looked across the Atlantic for new markets. While ramping up production, he did realize that the market in his own region was somewhat limited.
Part of the problem, of course, is that in Wisconsin, it gets very cold for half the year, and the lakes freeze over. So they had to figure out what to do during the winter months because they weren't going to be selling a lot of boats in January in Wisconsin, and that was when they started selling in Europe as well to address that seasonal issue. And so they did start selling them in Europe just a couple of years later. For example, uh, to fishermen in Scandinavia and places like that.
Hmm.
Because, I mean, obviously, having a boat was a huge advantage to someone who made their living catching fish.
The Evinrude company grew rapidly in Scandinavia, but also other places in Europe, and of course in the US as well. But expansion came at a cost. The increased workload began to take a heavy toll on the Evinrudes.
By 1914, Ole and Bess were feeling pretty burnt out due to the stress of growing their company, which was just zooming along. And so they sold out their half of the interest in the company to Chris Meyer, their partner, for what at that time was an enormous sum, $137,500. And Ole and Bess decided to just kind of goof off for a few years. They bought a cabin cruiser and took a long trip down the Mississippi River and various other places along the eastern coast. Um, and but as part of the deal of selling out, Ole had to sign what we today would call a non-compete agreement. And so he wasn't allowed to start a new company that was going to compete with the old one. And he also didn't no longer had the right to use the name Evinrude in any company that he started. So meanwhile, Ole did get an idea for a better outboard motor. For one thing, it was made out of aluminum, which is much lighter, and he tried to get Chris Meyer interested in producing the aluminum motor, but he wasn't interested. He didn't want to make the investment. He was happy with the way things were going. So Ole waited out the 5 year term of the non-compete agreement, and in 1920 launched a new company that was called ELTO, ELTO, which stood for Evinrude Light Twin Outboard.
And that also became pretty successful, didn't it?
It did. That company was very successful, and that led to this period of fierce competition between a small handful of companies that were making outboard motors at that time. Another part of the Rust Belt, northern Indiana, was the home of a company called Johnson, which became a prominent manufacturer of outboard motors for decades to come. And they were making really good motors throughout the 1920s. The original the original Evinrude company under Meyer's ownership, meanwhile, wasn't doing so great because he didn't want to make the investment to keep improving things, and so that company got sold a few times to various parent companies, and it ended up in the hands of a very important and well-known Milwaukee-based engine company called Briggs and Stratton in 1927. And then within a couple of years after that, Ole started thinking, I want my name back. And so in 1929, Evinrude, the old Evinrude company, Elto, Ole's newer company, and Lockwood Ash, that was a company that was based in Michigan, merged to form Outboard Motors Corporation, which is widely known as OMC, and with Ole serving as president of that company.
Hmm. And then after a few years, he passes away, and so does his wife. Did they work themselves to death, or what happened there? They weren't that old, were they?
They were not that old. The reality is that Bess had had a lot of health problems for a long time. She'd had a very difficult childbirth adventure when she gave birth to their son Ralph, and so she died in 1933, and Ole died the very next year, and Ralph took over as president of OMC. And then not too long after that, OMC ended up buying their big rival. Johnson was, those were the two heavy hitters at that point. It was OMC and Johnson kind of going head to head for outboard motor supremacy, and OMC ended up buying Johnson, and that was kind of the state of affairs for the next few decades. Ralph stayed in charge of the company, and they were the kings of the outboard motors.
And he kept on being the head of the company until the 80s, didn't he?
Yeah, Ralph ran the company until 1982, and then he passed away just a few years after that. Um,
And what is the afterlife of the company? Is it still in the family? I mean, like many of us have seen an outboard motor in our time with the name Evinrude. Is that
well,
still the same company or?
obviously, there are still a lot of Evinrude outboard motors out there that are still functioning just fine. But OMC actually went into bankruptcy in 2000, and then at that point, a Canadian company called Bombardier Recreational Products took ownership of both the Evinrude and Johnson brand names. And Bombardier continued making motors under the Evinrude brand for another 20 years, and then they just discontinued the brand a few years ago in 2020.
2020.
Yeah,
That's when it ended.
yeah.
So we won't see another Evinrude motor. New one.
Well, never say never. I guess somebody could resuscitate the brand. You never know.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the legacy. How did Evinrude change America?
Well, I think you could argue that nobody made a more important contribution to recreation on the water in the United States of America than Ole Evinrude. He was the innovator who really changed how people do recreation in this country. Whether you're in a part of the country where you can do it year round, or even in places like Wisconsin where it's cold part of the year. In the summer, everyone wants to get in their boat. We have a lot of lakes around here, and during the summer, you can't swing a dead cat without hitting a boat that is running with an outboard motor.
My name is Fredrik Halstveit, and this episode was made in conjunction with Vesterheim and with the support of Norway House Foundation in San Francisco. The music you hear in the background was made by Jan Skoglund.